Okay, I
All right.
think it's working. Off you go.
Okay. Well, hello everybody. Thanks for joining in. The talk I've entitled my talk as "From Staines to Putney via Tel Aviv," but generically this is entitled "Getting to Know You." Well, now this is getting to know me. Flattering. But I feel that we have to start with my families, as I'm a genetic combination of both. I come from Tarlow on my mother's side and Rosenberg on my father's. My maternal grandfather, Abraham Tarlow, landed in Liverpool about 1894, 1895, and according to his naturalization papers, was born in Crosnerty near Lodge. Then in 1909, he said he was a wood merchant. Later on, he said he was a draper. He was the first of 4 brothers to come to England, and as soon as he'd collected enough money, he sent for each one in turn. There were 4 of them. The earlier marriage certificate of my grandfather shows that he was married in 1903. I never knew either of my Tarlow grandparents, as they died within 3 months of each other in 1940 from natural causes. But he was an entrepreneur, because my mother used to relate that growing up in Upper Clapton Road, Hackney, they moved to London's East End in about 1913. The family would either be very rich after a deal went right, or very poor after a deal went wrong. He was a gambler, and apparently was also unable to resist an appeal for money from synagogue acquaintances for a get-rich scheme. My mother would tell of times when she and her sister would have to deny entry to the bailiffs who had come looking to take something away to pay off debts. But always it seemed they had enough to have a big Friday night table of food for family and any other Jews who were looking for a meal. It was a strictly kosher household. My mother had 5 siblings. All 6 of them went to university, 3 lawyers, 1 mathematician, my mother, 1 economist, my aunt, and 1 medical doctor. 2 of the lawyers became international bridge players, and both in turn captained the British bridge team. That's Louis Tarlow and Joel Tarlow. On the Rosenberg side, I did know both grandparents when they lived in Heatherdean Mansions just over Richmond Bridge in Twickenham. And my grandfather was working for Richmond Shul, acting as an agent for their Friendly Society, knocking on doors to collect subscriptions, apparently. But he was not friendly to us as children. If we visited, we were a disturbance to his Torah studies. No hugs, no kisses, no friendly word. He was also mean to my grandmother. She would slip us a coin, but she would whisper, "Don't tell your grandfather." They had 3 living children, but at least 2 children had died of TB, and one of them, Dan, was a handsome, brilliant scholar, having got a double first at Cambridge. He was a great loss. Moving down a generation, both my parents were born in 1908 in England. My father was an aeronautical engineer and a mathematician. His brother, a musician who had run away to sea in order to follow his career. He played the violin as part of a ship's orchestra. His sister studied law at the LSE. My parents met at university, Queen Mary College, University of London, where my mother took a maths degree. They married in 1933. Before the war, my father worked in one of the aircraft firms, probably near Staines, as they had a house there, and that's where I registered as being born. Although I was born in London Hospital, so I'm basically a Cockney, as I was born within the sound of Bow Bells there in London Hospital. Sometime around 1940, my father joined the civil service by working in the Ministry of Aircraft Production under Lord Beaverbrook. It was the job of the MAP to get the production of airplanes up to the maximum. I know that when my father was working in Cricklewood after the war, he was at the Hamdy Page factory as the resident technical officer who had to liaise between the Ministry of Supply, as it then was, and the manufacturer when they had a contract to produce military planes. He also did that with the Martin Baker Company, who designed and manufactured the ejector seat for airplanes. I was born on a stormy Saturday night on April the 17th, 1937, and was 30 months old when war started, and 7.5 years old when it ended in September 1945. I spent the whole of the war in North London, apart from a very short, unpleasant stay with a couple in Norfolk when my parents succumbed to the hysteria of the moment and tried to get my sister and myself out of the way of the bombs. So we came back and spent nights in the steel Morrison shelter under the dining room table whenever the sirens went off. I believe it had an influence on my life in known and unknown ways. But knowing how the Nazis used lists to round up Jews, I never volunteered that I was Jewish. Up to this day, I have never filled in a census or other form asking religion. We also heard anti-Jewish remarks, such as, "The war was our fault as Britain fought to help the Jews." Graffiti would appear on the walls saying, "Jews, go to Palestine," which is quite ironic when you think about it. I remember being on the top deck of a bus with my mother when someone was spouting off about Jews, and it really upset her. When my parents were lucky enough to find the house for sale in Totteridge, North London, in about 1940 or 41, I was able to get primary education at Beaufort Lodge Prep School in East Barnet. And then in 1948, I passed the 11 plus to enable me to go to Queen Elizabeth's Grammar School in High Barnet. I remember the meeting my parents had with the headmaster, Mr. Jenkins, before my admission. He said to them that just because we were Jewish, they must not expect any concessions from him, like time off for Jewish holidays, and they had to agree if I was to go there. He put me in a higher class than my age group. Very flattering for my parents, of course, but absolutely disastrous for me. How can an 11-year-old be put in a class of 12-year-olds just because he had a few French or Latin lessons? I had to start the new school with a group of boys who had already been a year together. So not only was I the youngest, but also the outsider, Jewish, and with the name Rosenberg. Only now does it occur to me that perhaps the headmaster wanted me to fail so badly that he could expel me. I believe he was anti-Semitic, and I'll come back to that later. My life at QE Boys was not easy, as instead of being in the top part of the class as I was at my prep school, I was nearly always at the bottom. I confess, my end-of-term reports arrived home sometimes with primitive forgeries as I tried to fool my parents that I had not done as badly as the figures showed. To their credit, my parents never questioned me on this. But fortunately, I was an athlete, and sport was very important to our school. I worked my way through the rugby teams, the Colts, the third, the second, the first 15, and should have been made either captain of the first 15 or the captain of the athletics team. I was a sprinter and achieved a bronze medal in the final of the 100 yards Hertfordshire County Athletics Championship. But at the joint teacher and student committee meeting held to appoint the captains, the headmaster sent me out of the room on some pretext. And then he told the committee that on no account to appoint me as a captain, as that meant he had to make me a full prefect. And as a prefect, I would have to read a lesson from the Bible in morning assembly. And as a Jew, he didn't want me. I was told this a bit later by another student member of the committee. The headmaster gave the name of the person he wanted in my place. I made no actual friends at school, except the only other Jewish boy that I knew of called Michael Wolff, and his home was the only one I ever went to. I was, incidentally, in the same form as Wilfrid de Ath, the journalist who gained a certain fame and notoriety in the 70s and 80s and went to prison for staying in hotels and restaurants and not paying the bills. His mother was German, and I have a feeling that she was pretty anti-Semitic as well, because he reflected it. I struggled through to the sixth form, and then academically, it got easier for me. I always felt like an outsider at school, perhaps because I was treated like an outsider, but I felt my roots were more the Middle East than the UK. The teachers were not friendly to me. The English teacher never gave me any part in any production. The Latin teacher asked, rhetorically, although one of the boys did answer him, how did I get into the school? And as Rosie was my nickname, a sports teacher once said in my hearing, a Rosie by any other name would still smell lousy. Amazing what one remembers. I passed my A-levels in English, French, and history. and applied and was accepted to go to the LSE to study law. My only revenge on the school was to deliberately leave the final term early and so miss the important rugby match against the old Elizabethans. Whilst I did not integrate with my fellows at school, my parents also did not integrate with local people. Our synagogue was Woodside Park, which we went to a very few times, but it was meaningless to me not knowing Hebrew, and we were a secular household. We did not keep kosher and celebrated the high holy days more by different food than anything else. Candles were not lit on Friday night. I was not able to attend religious school on Sundays to prepare for a bar mitzvah, as I was behind in my schoolwork. I was very ill with paratyphoid when I was 12 and missed a few months of school, being in Coney Hatch Fever Hospital in isolation. I did actually go once though, when the bearded teacher mumbled Hebrew, explained nothing, and left me totally bewildered. Furthermore, I had to go to school 6 days a week, Saturday morning lessons and Saturday afternoon sport, all compulsory. I went to the LSE in 1954 at the age of 17, changed my name to Rhodes in order to combat anti-Semitism or Rosenberg bias that could be around, as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg from the States had been executed for spying for the Soviet Union in 1953. My father had been going to exam board after exam board in the civil service to try to get establishment, which meant he would be in a permanent position of employment. Eventually he was granted it, but he always felt his name and being Jewish was the block, and I was sure he was right. I always said that people can dislike me, but not just because of a name or a label. My mother told me he was offered to be the head of the fledgling aircraft industry in Israel, but refused because he had signed the Official Secrets Act and felt that he would inevitably have to betray a trust if he was in Israel. He was an honorable man. Being young and immature for university, I failed the first year's exams and had to resit them in August. I swatted up during the summer and I passed, and after the 3 years got a degree. Criminal law I liked. I took part in an icicle play organized by a lecturer. My friend and I, in the middle of his lecture, had to play out a little scene. I was to suddenly stand up and start shouting and insulting the lecturer and telling him how terrible he was, and my friend had to defend him equally loudly. Then I pull out a gun and shoot him and rush out of the room. The rest of the class were pretty stunned by all this, but then were asked to report who said what to whom and when. The idea was to show that actual witnesses to a crime are not always reliable, and circumstantial evidence may be better. To become a solicitor in those days, you were articled and had to pay a firm to take you on. And that year there was a shortage of work. I had hoped my uncles, who had their own law firm, would help me. They wouldn't. So rather than have me hanging around the house, my parents suggested that I learn optics for 3 years instead. That must sound now very odd, but my mother had decided that that was what she would do, and she had started her own business in the Fulham Palace Road. And that came about in a strange way too. I mentioned that my mother was a mathematician, but she had not worked outside the home since having her first child, my sister, in 1934. Then, on her 40th birthday, 1948, she found no one at home remembered it, not my father and not us, the children. She was so upset that she sat down in the kitchen, calculated all the food she had cooked, all the dishes she had washed, all the ironing she had done, and said to herself, enough. She felt that maths must have moved on since her university days, so her brother, the GP, suggested she learn to be an ophthalmic optician, as 1948 saw the start of the NHS and free spectacles for all had created enormous pressure, with patients waiting up to a year for their glasses. He had his surgery and could help her if her work was close by. She applied for admission to East Ham College and was accepted for the evening course. My father was not happy that his wife was going off to East Ham and back to Totteridge by tube in the evenings, so he enrolled on the course to be with her. as did a friend who was a maths teacher in a school and who wanted another career. 3 40-year-old maths graduates enrolling for optometry. The optics course was run by William Swain, who wrote the textbook and was brilliant, but tended to be a little sloppy when writing maths equations on the board, making mistakes and getting the wrong answers. Not a good trait when teaching. Now, for the first time in his teaching life, he had 3 students who were following and could tell him exactly where he had gone wrong. In 1957, which is when I finished at LSE, my mother had built up her optometric business very nicely. Also by 1957, William Swain was head of the Department of Optics at what is now City University. I applied for his course. He called me for an interview. He said to me, "This is ridiculous. You have A levels in English, French, and history, and you're applying for a science course. How can I take you?" Then he sat back and he looked at me and he said, "Well, I knew your parents and you have a law degree, so start in September." I must admit it was a struggle, but after the first year, the work became clinical. And I was a good clinician, and so I finished on time in 1960. I took my first job in Crawley at the reasonable salary of £10 a week, and that allowed me to move to a boarding house with breakfast and an evening meal. At the age of 53, in 1961, my father died of leukemia, so I moved back home and worked with my mother. And in March 1962, she suggested we deserved a long break. She had already bought a camper van to drive around in, as it gave her the ability to stop and make a cup of tea when and where she wanted. She suggested we take the Dormobile and go to Israel for a visit. I'd already been once in 1957 with a university group when we had stayed at Kibbutz Zikim and toured the country, and I loved it. But the take the Dormobile was an interesting proposition. She found there was a regular visit of a cargo ship to Haifa from Venice with passengers, and it was prepared to have the van in the hold. It was sailing from Venice in early April 1962. We planned our drive down to Venice using the camper van as our hotel and arrived 2 days before the sailing date. Getting to the offices of the shipping line in the docks, they told us quite insouciantly that owing to the tides, the ship cannot come into the harbor to dock. So we would have to transport the van on a tender and drive it into the ship. I would have to do the driving. Okay. The next day, the van was put on the tender from the quayside and we chugged off to the ship moored outside the harbor. We could see that they were ready for us because there was a large hole in the side of the ship where they had opened a door. We bobbed alongside and the crew started to move planks out to reach to the tender. There were 2 that they put side by side, about the width apart of the tires of the van, stretching from inside the hold to the tender alongside. They then turned to me and said, "Drive it in." What could I do except start the engine and go? And fortunately, it worked and I was inside and not gurgling down in the water. They closed the hold and we then set sail for Haifa. But we had the luck of stopping in Beirut before we got there. And we and some other passengers took a taxi to Baalbek, the huge Roman remains east of Beirut near to Syria, which are fabulous. We went through lots of army or militia checkpoints as there was remains of a civil war going on, as is usual in Lebanon. The docking in Haifa was simple. The van was unloaded by crane. The road trip we made to Eilat was the turning point of my career, my life. I met Ella, fell in love instantly, and a series of obviously God-given coincidences meant that our lives were entwined ever since. But that is another lovely story that Ella tells better than I do. Ella came to London in the summer, Then we went back to Israel together, and I went to the Ulpan in Givatayim to learn Ivrit. By December the 4th of the same year, we were married, and I started work in the health clinics of the Histadrut. Half the week in Tel Aviv and half in Lod, the town, not the airport, as an optometrist. Optometry in Israel at that time was completely unregulated. Anyone could open a shop, test eyes as best they knew how, and sell glasses. The UK itself had only had regulation since 1958, but UK and American qualified optometrists were welcomed by the health institutions in Israel. Thus, I could work in the clinics and the hospitals, and we had our own association of optometrists. Part of our remit was to lobby to get a law to protect the public. We faced opposition from the very powerful group of ophthalmologists who saw us as competition. In the course of time, I was the secretary and then the president of the IOA, the Israel Association of Optometrists. I wrote a law based on the UK model and presented it to the Knesset in Israel for consideration. Unfortunately, it took a few years before the law came to Israel, but at least now the profession is legally protected for the benefit of the public. We had rented a furnished flat in Tel Aviv, but had no money as the salaries were poor, so we decided to return to London for a bit, where I could earn more money and come back later. So 1963 saw me in my mother's practice again, and she took herself off to an Ulpan in Netanya for 6 months to learn Hebrew. When we returned to Israel in January of 1967, we also had 2 small children, 1 small car, and all the furniture and white goods necessary to furnish a flat. I was really happy that my children would grow up in Israel as part of a majority and not a minority group. What could be better than being a Jew in a Jewish state? New immigrants under the age of 30 had to do full military service of 2.5 years at the time, but by April the 18th, I would be over that age, and I knew I would only have to do 3 months basic training and then reserve duty once a year. We bought a flat on the 7th floor of a block in Kiron, looking towards Jerusalem, and had just about moved in when the Six-Day War of June 1967 started. It had been a scary time building up to that, as Nasser had closed the Straits of Tiran, and Abba Evan was touring the world asking for support, as there was a casus belli, or reason for war. Those in the know knew that the preemptive strike on the airfields of Egypt meant that Israel would win, but we only heard Arab propaganda, which claimed enormous losses to Israel and huge successes for the Arabs. Israel has a policy of not giving out information on the radio during wartime, as this could aid the enemy, but it leaves us, the civilians, only hearing one side, and the Arab fantasists were working overtime. So we were scared, and every time the air raid sirens went off, Ella had to pick up the children, carry them both down the 7 flights of stairs, as obviously you're not allowed to use the lifts. I was fitting contact lenses in Tel Aviv, and although I tried to volunteer, I was told I wasn't needed. And anyway, my boss didn't want me to go. I was still working there in 1969 when my mother suddenly died, and I had to return to London to sell her practice as a going concern. The family came with me, and we stayed until 1970, but returning to Israel, I was offered, out of the blue, a new job. This was TAS, the Israel weapons industry. Ta'asiyah Tzva'it. It seemed that they were looking for someone who knew optics. I innocently took the job, but in the first week, it was obvious to all that I was not the right man for the position. They didn't need a clinician, they needed a physics graduate. However, it was difficult to sack people in those days in Israel. It was very union controlled. In the meantime, I was enjoying not having to deal with fussy people at work. That's fussy people at work in optics. The hours were easy, lunch breaks with after lunch football with the boys, transport to and from work, and a good salary. What's not to like? However, my conscience wouldn't let me rip off the state for too long. So I resigned after 3 months and let everybody off the hook. A friend of ours had retired as optometrist to the Air Force and suggested that I take over his job. It sounded good, so I agreed. We were based in a medical unit, and it was exclusively for the flying personnel of the IDF. Every year, they had to have a full medical, so their eyes had to be fully examined. Our other job was during the time when the 18-year-olds were recruited to the IDF. We examined many hundreds of volunteers for the flying course. Nearly everyone wanted to be a pilot. It was the elite choice. When I rejected a lad because of a fault or because he might develop a fault, like an early keratoconus, he got really cross with me and was begging for another chance, but I had to be tough. It cost so much to train a pilot that only the very best and the absolutely healthy could go through to the training. During my time, glasses or contact lenses were an absolute no-no for the pilots, but later they were allowed for navigators and pilots of transport planes or helicopters, but not for fighter pilots. I also worked with two-part female ophthalmologists who disliked each other intensely and were always trying to be one up. That was quite stressful for me, being friendly to both of them. I once made a big mistake. A pilot I knew from work told me he was flying over the canal to Egypt to carry goods and asked if I would like to accompany him. Naturally, I said yes, so he told me when and where to meet him. One of the ophthalmologists saw I was excited about something, and I made the error of telling her about my planned flight. And when I got to the airfield, I waited for my friend, and suddenly the doctor was there too. When the pilot saw her, he asked what she was doing there, and she said she wanted a flight to Egypt as well. He told her it was impossible, shooed her off, but was very cross. She left with her tail very much down, and I felt awful that I had revealed it. It taught me to keep my mouth shut. Another time, the commander of the unit asked me how we know that the result of the eye examination in the test room correlate to actual life. I told him that historically there have been tests. He said he wasn't satisfied with the answer. He wanted a practical test to be done. We took the bottom of the test chart, a letter E. Now that is called the 6/6 letter, the smallest letter, the 6/6 letter. It means it's a size which someone with perfect vision can distinguish at 6 meters or 20 feet for the Americans. The distance we test at under normal circumstances in the room is 6 meters or 20 feet. So that's where 20/20 comes from. You've got 20 feet and a 20-foot size letter to be recognized. The colonel wanted the test to be done at 5,000 feet. So I worked out the size the letter E had to be if we looked at it from that height, and the viewer had perfect 6/6 or 20/20 vision. The idea of using an E is that we can ask the direction the legs of the E are pointing, and it can be rotated to one of 4 directions, north, south, east, or west, or up, down, left, or right, whichever way you want to look at it, or in between. Now, if we have radio contact from the plane to the soldiers on the ground, they can rotate the letter and then ask the pilot which way it points. So a few weeks later, all was ready. They built the size of the letter E. My boss will pilot in a small plane. He and his second in command and myself get into the plane, and I sit behind the pilot. We take off, we climb up, and go to the field where we're going to do the test. Everything is ready, and he radios down to tell them to rotate the E, which they do whilst we circle. Both pilots look down and say in which direction the E is pointing. Then we need to know if they can still make it out correctly if we are higher. So we circle up and test again. Then we reverse and go lower, and all this is done a few times. Now, I'm not a good sailor and once got seasick on a boat in Falmouth Harbour. Going around in circles in a small plane and looking down out of the window at the same time is not conducive to feeling great. And I'm going greener and greener. I'm sitting behind a colonel and a lieutenant colonel in full Air Force blue uniform, and I want to be sick. I think they might have stolen a glance at me, and decided to call it a day because we did a sudden descent and I managed to hold everything in, but it was a close call. When we summed it up, it had worked out as it should have done, and we knew we could rely on testing at our standard 6 meters. October the 6th, 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out. Shabbat and Yom Kippur. Everything stops on Yom Kippur. The children ride their bicycles in the middle of the street and it is all quiet. But this year, suddenly, something is wrong. We hear traffic, sirens, lorries, it's not right. And then rumors, war. We listen to the radio. I have an emergency call up to a military unit. I'd done my basic training, so I was a rifleman, a private, but now I'm assigned to an anti-aircraft unit. I report immediately to the unit and I'm issued with kit. We go to the beach just north of Tel Aviv and a gun arrives. It's a 57mm Russian anti-aircraft gun captured in the Six-Day War from the Arabs. The gun is set up and we start to get training how to use it. It is primitive and essentially technology of the Second World War. We say to each other that if the safety of the state depends on us, then we're in a bad way. I suspect we are there more for the morale of the civilians than for hitting enemy aircraft. The next day, suddenly, I'm told to give my kit back and go home. Ella had had a phone call from my medical unit. And when she told the director that I was filling sandbags on the beach of Tel Aviv, he told her I was coming home, as he needed me in the unit. The pilots were flying all the time and were coming in for testing. So that ended my Yom Kippur War, and the gun was not fired in anger and went to the museum shortly afterwards. One of the very senior pilots had forgotten his training, and when his plane got hit, he ejected, but he forgot to keep his arms tightly to his sides as he went out, and he broke both arms. I saw him with them both in hard plaster sticking out, just like that. Very embarrassing. I'd already started a part-time, exclusively contact lens clinic, and it was getting busier. Ella was my receptionist and secretary. We felt that the time was right to build it up more, so I gave up my Air Force job and went part-time to Bellinson Hospital to teach the young doctors optometry and to help with patients. Hospital optics is very interesting because you're not usually dealing with healthy eyes, but unhealthy ones. I remember a young child who was born, well, a young child, she was a baby. She was born without the irides, without the irises. You know, the colored part, the iris. Without them, the eye is flooded with light and she will not develop sharp vision. I was asked by my professor if I could fit colored contact lenses to reduce the light to a normal amount. To measure the cornea, we fixed a date for the operating theater and put the child to sleep. Then I could take measurements and order lenses. I ordered them from a specialist firm in England. The parents had a tough time with the poor child having to put the lenses in and out, and I don't think it was 100% successful, but we did our best. This was before there were colored soft lenses. My contact lens clinic got even busier, and I was now full-time on my own. Moving on to 1987 and our 25th wedding anniversary, we'd planned an expensive holiday and I thought I would do well-paid locum work in London as an extra bonus. And I had a contact there to ask, and I had somebody in Israel who would look after my practice. The person in London was delighted to give me a job for a short time, as by chance at that moment, his optometrist had gone back to South Africa. He needed me in 2 shops, one in South Kensington and one in Gloucester Road. I worked in them both. And then at the Christmas party at the Café Royal for all the staff, he took me aside and sat me down and started to talk to me. And after a few drinks and a meal, Derek, my boss, began to talk about the future of the practices. He said he's selling them and that I should buy one or both. I knew that they were run down and not at their potential, but I'd had no intention of buying, as I knew how hard it was to have a happy clientele in Israel. I'd been through it once, I didn't want to go through it again. But Derek said to me, and he was right, that London was easier as we are not dealing with Israelis. I get home in the early hours and I tell Ella, much to her shock, that I bought the practice in South Kensington. We don't get our wedding anniversary holiday because we had bought an apartment as well after I bought the practice, and we had no money, just loans, age of 50, starting life again from scratch. Our 7th floor apartment in Kiron we left for our children to live in, for they didn't want to join us. Both had finished military service by then. But Derek was right, as it turned out, to be a good investment for us. And I had the time too to be the treasurer of the International Society of Contact Lens Specialists, a group of specialists from all over the world meeting every 18 months for a 3-day academic conference. I had actually been to the first conference, but not as a member when it was held in Jerusalem. South Kensington was a lovely place to work, and we had the pleasure of meeting, if I may be allowed to name drop, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Richard Gere, Christopher Reeve, Kylie Minogue, Wayne Sleep, Emma Chambers, 2 of the Rothschild sisters, Pat Cash, and many more lovely people, both well-known and unknown. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David, for that very interesting talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
You
Yeah.
had a very interesting life, and you're obviously highly talented.
Anybody want to ask me any questions about any of this?
David,
Yes.
here. I was sort of saddened by the way you were treated as a youngster in school. I find that really horrible, you know, and the fact that you survived that, you know, and came out as well as you did is credit to you, I think. I just find that really sad, you know.
It is sad, but it's not like that today.
Really?
Well, I don't know. When I went to school in Barnet, Barnet was not particularly Jewish. Totteridge was not particularly Jewish. There were Jews, but not particularly Jewish. And as I say, as far as I know, there were only 2 of us. There was only myself and the other Jew, Michael Wolf. There may have been others, but nobody that I knew of. And that's not a lot in a grammar school. Today, it probably would have been half Jewish.
This was quite interesting. David, what a lovely talk. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Thank you.
But I go back to school days.
Yeah.
My school days weren't very far apart from yours, but in time. But I had nothing like the experience that you've had.
Yeah.
And I'm quite shocked by it, actually.
Well, I think it was probably taken from the headmaster. I mean, the fact that the headmaster wouldn't make me a prefect because the question of reading, or the fact he said I can't take time off for Jewish holidays. I mean that's appalling. It would never go through the law this today.
No, the headmaster at my school let me set up a morning service for the Jewish boys.
Very good.
And that was in the time where I was 15, so that's 48. There was quite a naughty time in this country, and he was very brave to do it. So it's quite different. And I was a prefect, and I was all the other things. Yeah. So it's very different. Just want to say that.
Yeah.
David, where does the Raz come from?
Oh,
do you
yes.
do you regret at all not pursuing the law degree?
I did at one time, yes, when I felt it would have been a nice profession to be in, yes. But then when I started being successful as an optometrist, it was fine. And I've always been self-employed, which is great. It probably suits my character as well.
The name Raz came in.
The name Raz. Well, I changed, obviously, Rosenberg I was, as you know, and I changed, at one time I was known as, when I was working for my mother in her practice in Hammersmith, I was known as Mr. Tarlow because she called her practice under the name of Tarlow, which was her maiden name, and I was known as Mr. Tarlow. So I've had a few names in my time, but the name Rhodes, I thought, my uncle changed his name from Rosenberg to Rose, but I didn't particularly like that. I thought that wasn't right. So I changed it very more anglicized as Rhodes, perhaps not fashionable today, but Rhodes. And then when I was in Israel, people they wouldn't say Rhodes, they would say Rhodes. So, and there was also a movement in Israel for people living there, for citizens to have a Hebrew name. So I changed it to Raz, which is Hebrew for secret, actually. It's a nice word for a secret. It doesn't have to be Sod, it can be Raz. And also, it's incidentally, I learned that the Parsi for secret is Raz in Parsi. Pardon?
It's also secret.
Also a secret in Parsi, yes. And I thought Raz was quite good, sort of close to Rosenberg in a way, you know, the first start of it. But today, I'm sorry, I'm not a Rosenberg, because I think it would be nice to go back to my roots as a Rosenberg, because it's an accepted name now, really. Much more tolerant in this country.
Thank you.
David, do you have any Rosenberg relatives in London, by any chance?
No.
Can I ask you, David, was it Tarlow with a W? Or
No, Tarlow without a W.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, I know their grandparents came from Poland, but I don't know where the name Tarlow comes from. Yeah. But there are, I think, a few. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
David, I'd like to say how much I enjoyed the talk and the way you did it. I thought it was fascinating.
Thank you very much.
One thing you didn't mention, perhaps because it was later, with all the voluntary work you do for the synagogue and all the voluntary work you do for the synagogue.
Oh, yes.
And how you used to visit my husband when he was
Yes.
housebound.
I enjoyed it very much.
Well,
That was no burden.
Well, you gave him so much pleasure, and it was absolutely wonderful. It meant I could get out for a bit.
Yes.
But
Oh,
the
lovely.
pleasure you gave him was enormous, and thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure for me. It was a delightful man, very interesting. Yes, yes. Incidentally, talking about my law degree, and did I regret it? When I was in Israel, I was offered a job in the Bank Bein Leumi, using my law degree, presumably behind the scenes. But my salary at the time that they offered me was less than I was earning in Kupat Cholim. And you weren't earning much in Kupat Cholim. So although it was only the beginning, and if I'd stayed in Bein Leumi, Bank of Bein Leumi, I could have gone up quite high and started earning bankers' salaries, but that's another matter.
Sure you would.
And when did the children decide to come to England?
Well, they were there for what, 2 or 3 years, was it? And what? Yeah,
More or less, yes.
they had the flat to themselves. They could do what they like. I think they probably enjoyed a bit of time. I won't embarrass either of them by asking them to start telling us about it now. But my son decided that he wanted to study, and we were able to arrange him to come to the university in London here. And my daughter decided she wanted to study in America. And she, although she didn't actually begin studying in America, she actually did her studying back here in the UK. And then, you know, we sold the flat eventually in Israel. They came to England, and
Our son became a lawyer. And our daughter is the dietitian.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ella, I wonder if I could ask both of you, behind a great story like this, there's also a great woman. I mean,
Indeed.
what's your...
Look at me, I'm very small.
Well, small in stature perhaps, but you know, it would be interesting to have a little commentary, or perhaps your sort of view of the way that David and you built a life together in these different locations in a way. If you wouldn't mind, I mean, if you feel it's not appropriate, I'm very happy to just let it go.
Well,
Ella, you know, the funny thing is, I'll speak for Ella for the moment. Ever since I have started, I don't often speak for her, it's all right. Ever since I started work on my own, ever since I was self-employed, Ella was with me at work in Israel or in London or in, you know, South Kensington. Even when we were made a visit once to the UK, which I didn't put this in, but we made a visit to the UK, and for a year we were here with the children, and we had rented a beautiful apartment just off Hampstead Heath. Highgate. Highgate Ponds, just by Highgate Ponds. We rented a beautiful apartment there. Orly went to JFS for a year. My son was also there for a year. And I had a job working for an optometric company in Hendon, in Brent Street. And Ella was working there as my receptionist in Brent Street. So she has always worked for me in that capacity. And people say to us, how can you be together with your wife all day and at home all evening? It just doesn't seem to make sense somehow. But I want to tell you that it's an absolutely brilliant arrangement. And there are plenty of optometrists that I know whose wives work with them. And I have never known of any divorce among them. I think probably if you don't give a man an opportunity to play around, the marriage is stronger.
Right. I'll take that is your final comment on this.
Maybe Ella wants to say something, but...
Okay.
well, I met David when he came with his mother to visit Israel.
Right.
It happened to be the Pesach holiday, and we went to Eilat. I went with my boyfriend and another girl. We see in the middle of the desert a van standing and two people looking at maps. So we stopped and we asked if we can help them.
Wow.
And they said, we want to go to Eilat. So we said, we are going to Eilat, you can follow us. We took them part of the way when the army stopped us. At the time, it was the Fidayun that used to come and put mines and kill people. And the army said, it's getting dark, you are not going anywhere, you have to stop. And I said, I can't stop because I was teaching in the kindergarten. I said, I've got only the weekend, we are going. So he said, okay, keep distance from us. If we blow on a mine, you are far away. If we are safe, you are also safe.
Wow.
We arrived to Eilat, and the next day we are coming back. We stop at a petrol station, and in the petrol station, the tourists that we helped them the day before, they said, well, the army said not to go. So we went to Kibbutz Sde Boker and we stopped for the night.
I just want to say, just interrupting, that we were driving a cream and red Dormobile van that nobody had ever seen in Israel before. So we were quite distinctive.
Right.
And my girlfriend said, he looks nice. Shall I invite him to we're going to have a party at her place for Yom Ha'atzmaut. Pesach is very close to Yom Ha'atzmaut. So she said to David, if you want to see how Israelis celebrate Independence Day, come to my place. So she gave him her telephone number. And the evening of the party, on the afternoon, we are standing in the kitchen, the telephone rings, I pick up the telephone, and it's David on the phone. I say, Judith, your tourist is here. And she gives him instruction how to come. Come the evening, the doorbell rings, and the person dressed in a tie and suit and with a bottle of wine in his hand. Everybody is falling on the floor. Where did he fall out from? Dressed like this, coming to Israeli party. Well, he came to that party, and that didn't work for her, unfortunately. David went to England. Before he went to England, he asked if he can see me. And I said yes, but I forgot that on the same evening I had season tickets for the Israeli Philharmonic.
Right.
And a friend of mine that we were sitting one next to the other for years said to me, I can't go to the concert tonight. You want the ticket? I said, well, let me have it. I might be able to use it. When David came, I said, look, I'm sorry, I've got a ticket to the concert. If you are liking music, you are welcome to come. So we went together to the Philharmonic, and after the concert, we went to see his mother the night before they leave. And after meeting her and saying bye-byes, David take me home and he said, will you marry me?
Wow.
I said, oh, what do I know? A tourist, maybe he's married, maybe he's got family in England. How can I say yes? And my family didn't like my boyfriend. And they said, listen, you have got 2 months holiday, go to England and find out if he's married or not. I didn't want to go by myself, but my sister and my uncle went to a friend of theirs that bought me a ticket on a boat to go to Marseille. So I wrote today, he wrote me every day letters, and I said, okay, I'm coming to Paris on, it happened to be 14 Juliet. He said, I'll meet you in Paris. He met me in Paris after and very eventful day it happened to be, but we managed to meet, and we went to London, and he said, well, can you give me your answer? And I wrote to my parents that I accepted a wedding offer, and they were very happy because they didn't like the boyfriend that I had before. And then how we came to Israel, David went to the Ulpan. And after, when we saw that we needed more money to settle, it was a big disappointment for my parents that I went to London. That was a betrayal of a family. My grandfather came to Israel in 1882, and he built the Bilu Association in Russia. And being a granddaughter of a Bilui,
Yes.
it wasn't fit that their granddaughter will go to England. It was a great disappointment to the family, especially that we left with the family afterwards, and I wasn't forgiven for it.
Right. Yes. Actually, that thing about intergenerationally, when Israelis leave now, I mean, in my family, still that feeling by the grandparents of the grandchildren, you know, have gone to different parts of the world, and that sort of betrayal feeling. I can understand how difficult it was for you, because the guilt feeling must have been profound. But thank you for sharing that, because actually that's a story in itself.
It is. It's quite
Really
a story,
wonderful. And David, so romantic. I can't believe it. Yeah. It's amazing. Must have been fantastic music. What was the piece?
I want to tell you that I acted completely out of my character. My character is not one that either accepts invitations to parties from people that I've never met before, or ask people to marry them after the second meeting.
Right.
It
Amazing.
turned out okay.
Well, 58 years later.
Well done.
Fantastic. Amazing.
Well, to you both, really.
All covered. Right. Thank you.
Thank you both.
I understand you've got a grandson who's a doctor.
Yes, definitely. Yes.
Yes.
Actually,
Amazing.
he's listening to the talk. I can see his
Well,
name.
his computer is certainly on.
Hello.
Yeah.
I
Where
can
does-
see his name, but not his face.
Yeah.
Where is he?
Well, he's on
He's
YouTube.
in-
Yeah,
Hold on.
YouTube, on
In
YouTube.
Reigate,
Yeah.
in the hospital in Sussex.
Yes.
No, I can't do it. Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry.
Sorry, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
I can hear you. I want to see you.
I can't seem to figure out my camera.
Oh, well, that's a shame. For you, not to be
Have
able
you
to-
got a day off today?
I do. I was on call on the weekend, so I'm off today.
Oh, okay,
Oh,
great.
good luck to you.
Are you speaking?
I miss you.
I know. Me too. Me too.
Are you speaking to your grandson now?
Yes.
We'll speak later.
Okay, sweetie.
Thanks. So that was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can see Danielle's name there.
Yeah, is Danielle listening?
She's muted.
Yeah, Danielle.
No, Danielle's not there.
Oh.
Unfortunately, I'm logged on as the name Danielle. So hi, for those who don't know.
Okay, hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I'm
We're
Aurea,
recording.
and I'm David and Ella's daughter. So you asked something about my dad, and I said to my husband, should I interject and say something? So I think it was Alex that might have asked the question about living
Yes.
in both countries. And I just wanted to say that I think it's a wonderful thing because it teaches you that no matter where you are in the world, you can always build a great family and you can have a loving, caring home. And just to add one thing about my dad, I remember my childhood, about you.
Yeah,
And my dad, every school trip that we had, he volunteered to come as a chaperone. And I remember him sort of with, in Israel, you had to go on school trips with a rifle to protect the kids. And
Yeah.
he would always be there, even if we had to stay overnight in the field or in a tent or whatever. And for those of you from the community who know, he helped me build all the scenery for Danielle's bat mitzvah, which was a great success in our synagogue. So not only is he a great dad, but he's a great handyman, and they have a beautiful garden as well to prove it. And
thank you. This is,
home. So they've done well. They've done well as a couple, and he's done well as a human being as well.
well,
And
we're very proud of our children as
Only-
well.
well, you're a great inspiration to us.
Thank you.
Only that's something to hear from you.
Thank you.
Always.
Nice tribute.
Very nice.
And I'm
very
sure
lovely.
Danielle is listening in New York, but she's on a different time zone. So
Oh, yes.
she is going to try and log on to the talk, and hopefully if Judy.
Well, we have recorded it, so
Yeah,
that's
brilliant,
okay.
Because
Yeah.
Danielle is in New York, but she did ask to listen to the talk.
Lovely, thank you. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Right. Well, I think probably if there are no more things to say, I don't want to sit here and get compliments. So I think we'd perhaps call it a day.